And one thing I've been thinking about recently is really about the story of Jesus. And last week, one thing that I shared with you guys is that the story of Jesus is the most important story that we can tell. And it's a story I think that we need to tell over and over and over again. And not because it's like a classic all-time top 5 story, which it is, right? I mean, right now, ESPN doesn't have any sports to show because no sports are happening. So they're showing all the hardwood classics, all the classic games, and those are games we should rewatch because they're classic, they're awesome, they're wonderful. And Jesus, the story of Jesus is one of those stories. But it's not just that it's this old classic all-time story. We need to tell it over and over again because it is also our story. We are part of this story. And I believe this story has power for us today. I'm going to be honest with you guys this morning, and I'm sure some of y'all will resonate with what I'm going to share, but I've been struggling some. Part of me just wants to zone out for the next few weeks and crawl up under my covers and sleep and watch mindless YouTube videos and Netflix and just turn my brain off. My brain is tired. It's confusing to me because I'm not really doing anything all that physically taxing, but I feel so tired each day. It's been really hard to find inspiration, to feel God's presence, and to keep my eyes fixed on Jesus. The first couple of weeks, I feel like we're better. I was in like crisis mode, all this energy and adrenaline was running. But now it feels like I'm sinking into a bit of a rut. Do y'all feel like that? And I've been wondering, it's been hard for me because how do I offer as a pastor, as a preacher, inspiring words when I feel like this? How do I offer this up? Do y'all feel what I'm saying? Do y'all understand where I'm coming from? But then this past week I got to thinking about this and kind of the struggle that I'm having, and something came to me, and it's so simple and it's so obvious. And it's I don't always need fresh and inspiring words. Because we have this story of Jesus that is the most inspiring and important story we could ever tell. It's a story that was originally told to people who were struggling with fear, people who were struggling with anxiety, with stress, with uneasiness, with discouragement, with financial hardship, people who were struggling with pain, just like what we're dealing with today, and even more so probably. That's who heard these words first, and that's who was inspired by them. The story of Jesus inspired them and filled them and gave them the strength and the courage to keep on keeping on and march forward in spite of great opposition. And so let's hear the story this morning. The story of Jesus inspiring hope into people's lives that were struggling. This was their story, but it is our story too, and it still has power today. Last week on Easter, we talked about Mary Magdalene's encounter with the risen Jesus near the empty tomb. Mary was one of Jesus' best friends, one of his closest confidants. She was with him, so many ups and downs in his life. And when she went to the empty tomb, she found the gardener, she thought, but it really was Jesus, and he spoke her name, Mary. And her life was changed in that moment. He then told her to go back to where all the men were, all the rest of the folks. And he said, go tell all those men this important news, this really important news. She had the news first. She was able to report the story first. And she shared her story with the disciples about meeting the risen Lord. And guess what? The men didn't believe her. The testimony of a woman wasn't believed. I told you this story is our story too. This is current, right? This still happens today. The disciples and likely some other followers were in a house somewhere in Jerusalem, and they were hiding out in this home behind a locked door. And the gospel writer, it's interesting, makes sure that we know that detail. And it's this, that they were two details in this story, that the door was locked. And so they were hiding behind a locked door, and the writer lets us know that the door was locked because they were afraid. All right, these are two important details to the story. Why were they afraid? Well, the text tells us they were afraid out of fear of the Jews. This is something that was communicated throughout the Gospel of John at different places. Now, they weren't afraid of Jewish people. They were Jews, so they weren't afraid of Jewish people, but the Jewish leaders, some of them had become quite violent and were very committed to maintaining the status quo, and they were scared of these folks because these Jewish leaders did not like what Jesus was doing, disrupting the status quo, and they basically decided they're going to do whatever it takes to maintain the status quo and not allow things to change. But there were so many other reasons that they had to be afraid. Perhaps they wondered if the authorities would come after them like they had come after Jesus. Perhaps the authorities knew who they were. Did they know who Jesus' followers were? Did they see any of them at the crucifixion? Were they on some kind of list of people that needed to be arrested? Did Judas rat them out and give them their names? Did the government have their number and their address? They were afraid. Perhaps they were afraid that what Jesus promised wouldn't really happen, that this kingdom he proclaimed wouldn't ever come. Perhaps they were afraid that they had been fooled and that they were wrong. Maybe they had financial concerns. They took great risks to follow Jesus. Some of them left behind their nets and their jobs. Matthew was a tax collector, for instance, and probably made a pretty good living off of, taking advantage of his people with this tax collection, and he gave that up. And so maybe there were financial concerns. What are we going to do now? Things were so uncertain. Maybe they were afraid, but maybe they were also grieving and mourning the loss. I know they were, of their closest mentor and friend. Jesus had just died. Many of y'all have lost loved ones, and it's painful. Imagine how much grief they were experiencing. Another thing to consider is they were probably traumatized, particularly those who had witnessed the crucifixion. Some of them had witnessed and saw the most brutal form of execution imaginable. I just watched a movie a couple months ago, Just Mercy, and one of the scenes is of an execution by electric chair, and watching it was, even just watching a reenactment, it was a traumatic almost experience. It was hard. And you know what? They basically watched a lynching, and it was their most loved teacher and friend who was killed on the tree. The crucifixion was meant to instill fear in the hearts of the citizens. You don't mess with Rome. It's no surprise to me that they were locked up in a room, hiding out and stressed and scared. Of course they were. That's exactly what they would be doing. And here's a crazy thing, though. Even though the door was locked, Jesus found a way in. And I think that's a beautiful detail of the story. Even though the door was locked, Jesus got in. Even though the door was locked, Jesus got in. I think that's a powerful detail of the story. He entered into the room, likely scaring them half to death. Another gospel says that they thought he was a ghost, right? And then he says these familiar words that they had heard a few days before. He said, "Peace be with you." He spoke a word of peace to them to assure them that he wasn't a ghost. Shireen wondered, how did they know he wasn't a ghost? Well, he showed them his wounds. And he said, "Touch my body, touch the wounds." And as they touched him, they realized he's not a spirit. He's flesh and body and blood and bones. And John tells us that they were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. Their sadness and pain turned to joy. And then Jesus said it again. He said, "Peace be with you." He spoke another word of peace over them. And then he said he breathed on them. He breathed on them. He breathed new life on them. Right now, in our time of social distancing, breathing on someone sounds a little frightening, but this would have been a beautiful thing. And he breathed on them. They felt his breath, and he empowered them with the Spirit, and he commissioned them to unlock the door and to go out and share his life with a dying world. And then he left. Now, what a powerful experience, But you got to understand, Thomas wasn't there for this. But Thomas eventually showed up. Now, we don't know where Thomas was, but he missed out. He wasn't there. He missed out on this powerful moment. And so the disciples are like, Thomas, you wouldn't believe what happened. They told him what happened. But it's not surprising to me, like Dan said, that Thomas didn't believe. We shouldn't be too hard on Thomas. Thomas gets the name Doubting Thomas, which honestly, in the original, the Greek, it doesn't say anything about doubt. It says something about don't not believe, believe is basically what it says. It's not saying Thomas, it gets a bad rap, really, as being this huge doubter. But Thomas, he didn't ask for anything more than what the disciples asked for. You got to understand, even Mary, she didn't believe until she saw Jesus and he said her name. The disciples didn't believe the testimony of Mary until they saw Jesus face to face. And Thomas, he didn't believe until he saw Jesus. He needed to see Jesus also. About a week went by and they were back in the house again with the doors locked. And Jesus entered the house one more time. Thomas needed to see Jesus. And guess what? Jesus showed up for Thomas. That's beautiful. Thomas needed something from Jesus and he showed up. What a great moment of compassion and care. Thomas needed something so that he could have faith. And Jesus gave Thomas what Thomas needed. He didn't rebuke him. He didn't shame him. But he showed up for him in his moment of need. And Jesus said again, 3 times now, he said, peace be with you. He spoke this word of peace over Thomas. And he told Thomas, he said, Thomas, touch my wounds. And then and then Thomas after this gives the greatest affirmation of faith in the Gospel of John. He says, my Lord and my God. And then Jesus essentially tells Thomas to go out and share with others so that they could also believe. He's like, blessed are those who are going to believe without even seeing me. And in a sense, he's saying to these guys, it's y'all's job now to go out and share it with others, to share this with other people so that they too might believe what you have seen firsthand. Now, I want y'all to imagine how influential Thomas's testimony must have been. I mean, if Thomas witnessed to me back then, I probably would have believed him. I mean, he'd be like, yeah, I didn't believe it at first. I didn't believe it. He's like, I went an entire week. I struggled for a whole week thinking my friends were hallucinating. It affected our friendship. We had some problems because I didn't believe. But then I too saw Jesus. I touched Jesus. And I'm telling you, it was him. I was scared to death, hiding behind a locked door, but I'm no longer locked up. I'm not allowing fear to hold me back, and I'm sharing this good news with you today. Imagine how powerful that testimony would have been. So at the end of this passage, the gospel writer of the Gospel of John shares these words, and I want to share them with you. He says this, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. And that by believing you may have life in his name. This story has been written over and over and over again. It's been told over and over and over again so that people will believe that Jesus is the one we've been waiting for, and also that Jesus is the one who gives life. This story gives life to the dead. This story can speak to us and empower us, especially in the midst of a challenging time like we're living today. I think times like these are when the gospel is especially powerful. Because you got to understand, this is what the gospel is for. It's for us when we're struggling and we're suffering. That is when it shows up and it shows out for us. Because the gospel really is good news for those who are struggling. The gospel really is good news for those that feel like their backs are against the wall. There's a guy named Howard Thurman who wrote a book that I read last year, a couple of years ago, called Jesus and the Disinherited. And it's a beautiful book, and it was a book that said that Martin Luther King Jr. carried around with him because he believed in it. It was so powerful to him. And Howard Thurman was a brilliant black theologian, a very spiritual man, a thinker, and what he did is he wanted to, because he had been handed down a religion that was really a religion of the powerful, of the oppressor. It was a religion of the slaveholder. And he couldn't accept that that's what the gospel was about. And so he wanted to find out, is the gospel really good news for the people who are being oppressed and pushed down and hurt, the people who truly have their backs against the wall? And he concluded that yes, indeed, the gospel is good news for them, and it is actually written for them. He points out Jesus was poor. Jesus was oppressed. His followers were poor and oppressed. They were marginalized folks, and the gospel inspired hope and power. Christianity isn't a religion for the powerful and elite. It's meant to be a religion of the slave. It's not meant to be a religion of the slaveholder and colonizer. It is a grassroots movement of the Spirit that empowers struggling and broken people to have courage and confidence in the face of incredible challenge, even when the odds are stacked against them. I'll repeat that. It is a grassroots movement of the Spirit that empowers struggling and broken people to have courage and confidence in the face of incredible challenge, even when the odds are stacked against them. The movement of Jesus is for the slave, it's for the colonized, it's for the oppressed, it's for the broken, for the mourning, for the grieving, for the person who truly recognizes their need for freedom and for healing. Where do you find yourself in this story? I want y'all to settle down for a moment. Where do you find yourself in this story? For some of us, we may feel like we're locked up. And we're locked up in a place of loneliness, of isolation and grief. Do y'all feel like that? That you're locked up in a place of loneliness, isolation, and grief? Particularly right now with this physical distancing and we can't be around people, you may feel very lonely, isolated, and you may be grieving even the loss of people that you've lost in your life. What I want you to do now, if you're willing, is just to close your eyes for a moment. I want you to imagine, wherever you're at, Jesus entering the room and speaking a blessing of peace over you. I want you to imagine him reaching out and touching you in a loving and gentle and healthy way, communicating care and compassion and concern. I want you to imagine Jesus wrapping his arms around you, giving you a big hug. Imagine him close. You can feel his breath, and you're reminded that you're not alone, that he is there, that he loves you. This story is your story. For others of us, we may be afraid. Maybe you're experiencing fear. Maybe you're flat out terrified that you're going to get sick. Maybe your financial situation is difficult and you're afraid it's going to be too much. Maybe you're afraid that your business is not going to make it. Maybe you're afraid that you're going to lose a loved one to this virus. I want you to close your eyes for a moment. And I want you to imagine Jesus. Here's what I'm imagining. Jesus firmly holding your head in both hands. And he's looking into your eyes. And he's telling you you're going to be okay. That he indeed has conquered death and overcome the world. Imagine him telling you this is not the end. I hold eternity in my hands and your future is secure in me. This story is your story. For me, this story is not about Thomas's doubts, really. It's about Jesus' love, care, and compassion for his friends who were deeply struggling. He showed up for them, he tended to their needs, and he cared for them. And so as you go through the ups and downs of your week, as you face really low lows, I want you to place yourself back in this story and be reminded that Jesus runs after the broken ones, that he pursues those who are struggling, and that no locked door can keep him out. Friends, those same scared and discouraged women and men who were hiding out in that locked room in Jerusalem eventually found the courage to unlock the door and enter into the dangerous world. And you know what they did? They spread the life and love of Jesus in their communities. Many of them refused to back down, even as they faced persecution and violence and death. The Holy Spirit lives within you, and you can do this. I'll close with these words from Jesus, and he shared these shortly before his death. During that last kind of time he shared with his disciples that we call the farewell discourse in the Gospel of John. And maybe if you just need to focus and close your eyes to hear these words. All this I've spoken to you while still with you. But the Advocate, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, will teach you all things and will remind you of everything I have said to you. Peace I leave you, my peace I give to you. I do not give as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid. Peace I leave you, my peace I give you. I do not give as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid.